Hello, my friends. Let's start with the European Union talking about appointing a Putin negotiator. According to Politico, the EU is looking for someone to speak with Vladimir Putin. In a normal world, that would be the job of the EU's foreign policy apparatus. Kaja Kallas's office engaging Sergei Lavrov, diplomacy rolling forward through official channels, and if it got serious, eventually you'd see a high-level meeting between Putin and Ursula von der Leyen. That's how institutions are supposed to work. But everyone knows it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. Callas cannot be the person to engage with Lavrov, and Ursula cannot be the person to engage with Putin, not after years of public maximalism, moral posturing, and an openly declared agenda of Russia must lose. Moscow isn't going to treat those faces as serious negotiators. So what does the EU do? It looks for a proxy, a workaround, someone who can carry messages and create the appearance of diplomacy without forcing Brussels to swallow the humiliating truth. Russia is winning this conflict. Trump is already positioning himself as the mediator, and the EU does not want to be left outside the room when the terms get written. That's why they want a seat at the negotiating table. And the person Politico says they're looking at is Alexander Stubb, the leader of Finland. And the rationale being floated is almost comical in how revealing it is. Stubb is qualified because he's on good terms with Trump and even plays golf with Trump. So that's the credential now being Trump's golfing buddy. Not strategic depth, not authority over EU policy, not an ability to deliver agreements. Golf. That's the level European statecraft has fallen to in this moment. And Stubb is the kind of figure who likes to talk about the history between Finland and Russia while demonstrating he doesn't actually understand it. But that's not the point. The point is access to Trump, because Trump is the gatekeeper Europe fears most right now. And that fear is peaking because Davos is next week. January 19th is the World Economic Forum in Davos. Eat your bugs. Enjoy the lectures from the same managerial class that keeps driving Europe into the wall, and watch the cool kids gather again to congratulate themselves. This year, it's being framed as a big Davos. All the EU top officials will be there. European leaders, the collective West leadership, everyone represented. Zelensky will be there too, running around Davos, Switzerland, looking for money because that is what Project Ukraine has become, a permanent fundraising tour with a war attached to it. And Trump will be their keynote speaker. That's what has everyone panicking and guessing. What is Trump going to say at Davos? Will it be pro-globalist, pro-empire, or anti-globalist, anti-empire? And the deeper question, do his words even matter anymore? Or is the performance just cover for a decision that's already been made behind closed doors? According to the Financial Times, the Europeans are going to be chasing Trump for a meeting so they can figure out Project Ukraine. For them, the most important objective is to get Trump to commit to U.S. backstop security guarantees. They want Washington to provide the umbrella that makes a European deployment even possible. And here's the confession. The UK and France, Macron and Starmer, are talking about putting boots on the ground if there's a ceasefire. Numbers being floated, roughly 7,000 British troops, 6,000 French troops. They're ready to go, they say, but only if there's a ceasefire. And even then, it's impossible without the United States providing security. Financial Times says the diplomats admit it. Boots on the ground is impossible without U.S. protection. So Europe wants to look tough and independent. But the moment reality shows up, it's back to begging Washington for permission and protection. That's why Davos matters. It's where Europe will try to corner Trump, flatter him, bribe him with rhetoric, and secure the U.S. guarantee that keeps the entire facade standing. And while they're chasing Trump, they'll also be circling around Greenland because Greenland has become the stress test for whether Europe is still allowed to pretend the transatlantic relationship is partnership rather than hierarchy. Before we get fully into Greenland, though, we have to talk about Witkov and Kushner. Bloomberg says they want to go to Moscow again. Another trip, Witkov and Kushner. If Putin agrees to see Witkov again, this would be something like the 7th or 8th trip for Witkov and the 2nd trip for Kushner. But the timing is what makes it so grotesque. This would be the trip following the alleged drone assassination attempt, alleged drone strikes aimed at Putin's residence around Valdai Novgorod, depending on the report. If this was indeed an attempt to take out Putin and if the U.S. was behind it, whether Trump greenlit it or the CIA did it and briefed him after, then what do Witkov and Kushner say in that meeting? Just business? Nothing personal, Mr. President. Mafia foreign policy dressed up as statecraft. Nothing personal, just business, capiz. No hard feelings. Now let's talk about a Ukraine peace deal. That's the moral rot right there. Escalation and covert violence paired with smiling envoys who want to negotiate stability as if the previous act never happened. From there, the narrative pivots to Iran, and again Witkov's name comes up. Axios reports that Witkoff had a secret meeting, so secret Axios published it with Iran's exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi. The man has been making the rounds on collective West media outlets urging Trump to go to war with Iran, and why wouldn't he? If there's a regime change and Washington picks him as the alternative, he benefits massively politically and materially. Axios doesn't give many details about what was discussed, but protests were discussed, and now we're watching the death toll become a propaganda war. Low-end estimates are in the 1,000 to 2,000 range, including protesters and police, and it has to be said that hundreds of security officers have also been killed or injured. Then you get the high-end numbers pushed by CBS News, 10,000 to 15,000, and I've seen other reports claiming 20,000. Crazy numbers. And with communications restricted and information controlled, it's hard to know what to believe. But even in the West, it now appears widely accepted that Iran has gotten on top of the protests and things are under control. Axios also reports that Rubio, in closed-door meetings, said the administration is looking at non-kinetic responses to help protesters. Cyber attacks, information war, other covert operations. Not overt airstrikes, not military. At least that's the line. Trump says he knows what the response might be, but claims he hasn't decided and wants an accurate briefing about the death toll. Notice the shift. It's not uranium enrichment anymore. Forget enrichment. Forget ballistic missiles. Now it's all about the protesters. That's the new narrative hook for meddling. Trump even posted on Truth Social encouraging protesters to keep protesting, to take over institutions, to save names of killers, promising they will pay a big price, canceling meetings until the killing stops, and declaring, help is on the way. That's regime change language, plain and simple. And you'd think Trump, of all people, might be hesitant about encouraging meddling in another country's domestic affairs, but no, he's encouraging it openly. Then you have the Starlink story, videos and images circulating of Iranian authorities showing hundreds of Starlink terminals allegedly seized. Are the images real? Are they staged? Hard to say. But the messaging is clear. Communications infrastructure tied to foreign actors is being framed as a tool of subversion. Elon Musk up to no good, as the narrative goes. Whether that's propaganda or not, it feeds directly into the broader theme. The West wants influence without responsibility, intervention without fingerprints. Now to Greenland. Trump told reporters Greenland will have big problems if it doesn't agree to give itself up to the United States. He was asked about comments made by Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, and Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, who said publicly right before flying to the U.S. to meet Vice President Vance and Marco Rubio that Greenland chooses Denmark. If forced to choose between the U.S. and Denmark here and now, they choose Denmark. They choose NATO. They choose the Kingdom of Denmark. They choose the EU. Trump's response, reportedly at Joint Base Andrews, I disagree with them. I don't know who he is. I don't know anything about him, but that's going to be a big problem for him. Think about that. The President of the United States is openly threatening the leader of a territory he wants to control and admits he doesn't even know who the leader is. He doesn't care. He's not even pretending to care. He knows what he wants and assumes the rest will bend around that. And Nielsen's statement itself is revealing. We choose Denmark, we choose NATO. NATO is led by the United States. We choose the EU. The EU is strategically subordinate to the United States. So even in declaring independence from Washington's immediate demand, Greenland's leadership is still declaring allegiance to Washington's architecture. It's 50-50 choosing Denmark while choosing the U.S. system. Politico reports that EU diplomats are now going all out to make a deal with Trump, doing whatever they have to do to make it look like the United States has not annexed Greenland, but is instead partnering with Europe and NATO on Arctic security, bases, and mineral extraction. The point is to prevent a catastrophic rupture inside NATO and to avoid a public spectacle that exposes the truth about Europe's status. Politico frames it bluntly. EU governments believe a military confrontation would be catastrophic for NATO, so negotiated solutions are their only option. And the heart of the matter is almost absurd. They want to give Trump a win on Greenland without Trump officially annexing and taking Greenland. How do you do that? That's the pickle. So the ideas being floated sound like surrender wrapped in legal language. A security agreement, a lease, NATO basing, joint military buildup, mineral extraction rights where the U.S. gets a big chunk of revenue, a partnership branded to look cooperative. One diplomat's logic is telling. Smartly repackage Arctic security, blend in critical minerals, put a big bow on top, and maybe Trump signs. But again, let's be honest, this isn't about Trump saving face. It's about the EU saving face. Europe's leaders fear the illusion breaking, the illusion that Europe and the U.S. are equal partners. Because if Trump can openly demand a chunk of Europe's strategic space, and Europe responds by negotiating the terms of its own humiliation, then the public will see what has been true for a long time. Europe is not a partner, it's a vassal structure. That's why Greenland is so dangerous for Brussels and Copenhagen. Not because Greenland itself is some mystical prize, though it is strategically valuable, but because it exposes the hierarchy. It's the moment the best friend's story collapses. Two friends claim they're equals, and then the stronger one says, "I'm taking your car." The weaker one says, "But we're best friends, we share everything, we're on the same level." And the stronger one repeats, "I'm taking your car." So the weaker one starts bargaining. "Fine, here are the keys, here's a spare set, you can drive it anytime, I'll pay for gas and insurance." And the stronger one says, "No, I'm taking your car." That's Greenland. If Trump doesn't take it officially, he will take it functionally. The label doesn't matter. Control is control. Meanwhile, the kinetic reality in the Black Sea keeps creeping upward. 3 tankers were hit by drones, tankers from Kazakhstan, reportedly transporting oil connected to a Caspian project partly owned by Kazakhstan and involving US companies. Reports say Ukrainian drones, but anyone serious understands what that usually translates to. Collective West, enabling satellite guidance, targeting support, intelligence scaffolding. Behind the Ukrainian label, you can often trace a line through the UK and France, and eventually to US 3-letter agencies. It's a messy, escalatory environment where even US-linked business interests become collateral damage because proxy warfare doesn't stay tidy. Russia still has pressure operating around Odessa, semi-blockade dynamics still in force. Putin is back from the holiday period, meeting with officials and discussing domestic issues. No major foreign policy statement yet on all these provocations. Venezuela, Maduro, tankers, Greenland, but the larger strategic picture doesn't require daily speeches. Moscow's posture is set, and it's Europe that is flailing. Then you have the Czech Republic story, a scandal around a covert Ukraine arms program. The new government under Babiš is unveiling details about $13 billion of mostly foreign money routed through the Czech Republic to purchase weapons and send them to Ukraine, with allegations of hidden budget allocations, 17.1 billion crowns, around $822 million kept secret. The former leadership rebukes Babiš, accusing him of endangering safety by exposing it, which is the standard move. When someone reveals the pipeline, you accuse them of threatening the pipeline's beneficiaries. But the pattern is familiar. Large sums of money moved quietly through trusted nodes, hidden from domestic populations, justified by moral narratives, and protected by secrecy. We'll see what else gets disclosed. South Korea adds another layer. The former leader, Yoon Suk-yeol, accused of insurrection over his 2024 martial law declaration, may be facing the death penalty. That crisis had connections to the broader Ukraine weapons pipeline story. Legal constraints on direct weapons transfers, workarounds through U.S. purchases, shells moved onward to Ukraine. These schemes don't just distort foreign policy. They destabilize domestic politics in allied countries and create constitutional crises when the public begins to see the machinery. And in the elite immunity category, we have the Clintons refusing to testify to Congress on Epstein-related inquiries, despite a duly authorized request. Bill Clinton posts platitudes about right and wrong and no one above the law, while the reality is that the protected class continues to operate with a level of impunity ordinary citizens never get. There may be noise, there may be headlines, there may be posturing, but the system has shown repeatedly that it will bend to protect its own. So here is the coherent thread tying this whole day together. Europe is trying to reinsert itself into negotiations because it knows the war is not going its way and because it fears the US will cut a deal that leaves Europe holding the bill and the humiliation. Davos becomes the arena where Europe will swarm Trump, begging for backstop guarantees, begging for relevance, begging for the illusion of partnership to remain intact. Greenland becomes the brutal exposure of hierarchy, the moment where Europe has to negotiate the terms of its own subordination while pretending it's a cooperative framework. Iran becomes the classic Western play. Shift the narrative to humanitarian concern, escalate covertly, deny militarism while preparing the ground for destabilization, and keep the public hooked on casualty numbers that cannot be verified. And through all of it, the same system shows its signature. Rules for others, flexibility for itself, sovereignty for speeches, coercion for reality, accountability for enemies, immunity for insiders. That's where we are. Not in a world of shared values and alliances of equals, but in a world where power is naked again, where Europe is trying to save face while surrendering leverage, and where Washington, whether under Trump or anyone else, still operates as the center of gravity that everyone else orbits, fears, and ultimately obeys. If you want to understand where this is going, stop staring at the headlines like they're separate events. They're not. They're one connected system, one continuous pressure wave moving through the collective West, and the shock points are exactly the places you'd expect: Ukraine, the Arctic, Iran, and the internal political stability of Western-aligned governments. Europe is not appointing a Putin negotiator because it suddenly discovered the value of diplomacy. Europe is doing it because it senses deep in its bureaucracy that the war narrative is collapsing under the weight of reality. Russia is not about to collapse. Russia is not running out of missiles. Russia is not isolated. Those talking points were designed to keep Europe compliant, to keep the public docile, and to buy time for an outcome that never arrived. What arrived instead is the unglamorous truth that decides wars: industrial capacity, manpower, strategic depth, and the ability to absorb pain without breaking political cohesion. And that's the terrifying part for Brussels. Moscow's political cohesion is held, while Europe's is cracking. You can see it in every election, every scandal, every sudden budget crisis, every angry farmer convoy, every wave of strikes, every disgusted population being told to accept lower living standards as a virtue. The EU is trying to negotiate not from a position of strength, but from a position of impending embarrassment. Because if Trump sits down with Moscow and produces something that looks like a settlement, even a temporary one, Europe's entire posture becomes exposed as theater. All those speeches, all those sanctions, all those historic packages, all those moral lectures gone in an instant, reduced to a footnote in someone else's deal. Europe knows that if it's not physically in the room, it will be handed a bill and a script. The bill will be financial and social. The script will be political. This is the best we could do. That is why they're scrambling to insert a face, any face, into the process. Golf credentials, personal rapport, anything that gives them a hook into Trump's inner circle. Davos, in that context, is not a conference. It's a desperate networking event for a dying narrative. It's where the managerial class tries to reassert control with optics, photo ops, side meetings, communiques, smiling handshakes. They will call it unity. It's not unity, it's damage control. And look at the Ukraine boots on the ground idea for what it really is: a confession that Europe cannot sustain Ukraine without US backing, and a gamble that the US can be pressured into underwriting Europe's prestige. They're talking about 7,000 British troops and 6,000 French troops, as if numbers alone create credibility. In a war environment saturated with drones, precision strikes, and layered air defense, those numbers are not a force. They are hostages. They are symbolic tripwires, human insurance policies intended to force Washington's hand. Because once Europeans put troops on Ukrainian soil under any label: peacekeeping, monitoring, stabilization, the first serious strike that hits them detonates political panic. And then Europe will do what it always does when confronted with real danger: it will demand the United States escalate on its behalf. The so-called backstop is not a technical detail. It is the entire point. Europe wants to outsource the consequences of its own decisions. Now set that beside Greenland, and you see the same structure. Europe wants to preserve the illusion of partnership even while it yields substance. Greenland is not just about mineral extraction or basing rights. Greenland is about hierarchy, about whether Europe can continue telling its citizens that they live in a sovereign bloc, or whether they must finally admit they operate inside an American security empire. Trump's bluntness accelerates the exposure. Previous presidents did the same thing in softer language. They took what they wanted through agreements, frameworks, partnerships, NATO modernization, interoperability, shared security objectives. Trump just says the quiet part out loud: I want it, hand it over, or there will be problems. That's why the EU is frantic to craft a win for Trump that doesn't look like annexation. They need packaging. They need a story their publics can swallow. We made a deal. We strengthened NATO. We secured the Arctic. We established a joint minerals partnership. They need the language of dignity to cover the mechanics of cover, submission. But the mechanics don't change. Control is control. If the U.S. gets basing rights, strategic command presence, and privileged access to extraction revenue, Greenland becomes, in practice, an American strategic asset regardless of the flag on paper. Europe's leaders know this. They just don't want their populations to say it out loud. Now, pivot back to Iran and you see a different but related pattern: narrative substitution. When the old casus belli gets stale: nuclear enrichment, missiles, regional behavior, you swap in a fresher emotional trigger: protesters, humanitarian concern, killed in the streets. It doesn't matter that casualty numbers are unverifiable. Large numbers create moral urgency. Urgency creates permission. Permission creates action. Rubio's non-kinetic line is classic modern warfare phrasing. It sounds restrained, civilized, responsible. In practice, it means covert escalation, cyber operations, information war, funding networks, communications infrastructure, sanctions tightening, and all the tools that destabilize a society while allowing the sponsor to deny direct responsibility. This is why the Starlink story matters. Even if half of what circulates is propaganda, the underlying logic remains. Communications networks are the arteries of modern unrest. If a state believes foreign-backed systems are enabling mobilization, it will move to seize them. And when those systems are tied directly or indirectly to powerful Western actors, you get an ugly feedback loop. The West frames seizure as tyranny. The state frames it as self-defense. The public is fed curated images. And policy is made inside an echo chamber of moral certainty. And then you've got the exiled crown prince angle, an old imperial template dressed in modern branding. Find a legitimate figure outside the country, polish him, platform him, and keep him ready as a symbol of transition. This is not new. What's new is how openly it's discussed now, and how quickly Western media will normalize it when it becomes useful. That's the external picture. Now look internally: Czech Republic, South Korea, Epstein, elite immunity, and you see the same machinery turning inward. The Czech pipeline scandal is not just corruption, it's a symptom of wartime governance without democratic consent. Large sums move through back channels, shielded by secrecy, justified by moral messaging, and protected by fear. Fear of losing power, fear of public backlash, fear that transparency will trigger political collapse. When someone exposes it, the accusation is never "you are lying." The accusation is always "you are endangering people." That's the tell. When a system cannot defend itself on truth, it defends itself with panic. South Korea's crisis is another version of the same. Legal constraints collide with geopolitical demands, so workarounds are built. Workarounds create domestic instability. Instability produces extraordinary measures. Extraordinary measures produce political ruin. And the public is told it's all for democracy, all for security, all for values. Meanwhile, the actual operating purpose is to keep the project running: the pipeline, the supply chain, the war economy. Then Epstein and the Clintons, elite immunity on display. The rhetoric is always the same: no one above the law until the law touches the protected class. Then it becomes procedure, delay, lawyers, we will not comply, and the entire system quietly accommodates it. That's not an accident. That is how the hierarchy maintains itself. The public is managed with slogans. The insiders are managed with deals. Put all of this together and you get a single conclusion: the collective West is not unified. It is synchronized. And synchronization is not the same thing as health. It can be a sign of a system being forced to move in one direction despite internal fracture. What we are watching now is a pressure convergence. Ukraine is the financial and military sinkhole. Greenland is the sovereignty stress test. Iran is the narrative substitution theater. And Europe is the anxious middleman, terrified that Washington and Moscow will settle without it. The deeper truth is that the war has shifted from being about territory in Eastern Europe to being about the structure of Western power itself. Who commands? Who pays? Who takes the risks? Who gets the spoils? Who absorbs the blowback? Europe is learning painfully that it pays and absorbs blowback, while the U.S. commands and extracts strategic advantage. That is why Europe is frantic to be at the table. Not because it believes in peace, but because it wants to negotiate the terms of its own subordination. And Trump, whether you love him or hate him, is forcing clarity. He strips away the language that European leaders rely on to deceive their publics. He doesn't speak in the soft euphemisms of managed empire. He speaks in blunt property terms: take, keep, win, lose, deal, threat, leverage. And that bluntness is what terrifies the globalist class, not because it changes the underlying relationship, but because it makes the relationship visible. So here is where this ends, at least for today. Europe will go to Davos like supplicants dressed as executives. They will smile, they will praise, they will promise more spending, more alignment, more sacrifice, as long as Trump gives them what they need most: the illusion of agency. They will present it as strategy. It will be dependency. Greenland will be wrapped in a partnership bow, but the box will contain the same reality: U.S. strategic control, expanding under a NATO label. Iran will be framed as helping protesters while covert instruments sharpen in the background. And Ukraine will remain the gravity well, pulling everything into it: money, weapons, legitimacy, stability. And in the middle of this, Russia will do what Russia has been doing all along: wait, grind, negotiate when it's advantageous, refuse when it's not, and treat Western theatrics as exactly what they are: performances aimed at domestic audiences. That's the part many Western commentators still don't understand. Moscow does not need to match Western drama. It doesn't need to win the news cycle. It needs to win the structure. It needs outcomes. It needs security terms. It needs a settlement that reflects facts on the ground, not the fantasies printed in Brussels communiques. So the real question isn't what Trump says in Davos. The real question is what Europe will agree to when it realizes it cannot compel either Moscow or Washington, only plead with one and provoke the other. The real question is how long European populations will tolerate being lied to about partnership while living the consequences of vassalage. And the real question is whether the West, in trying to hold the empire together, ends up breaking the very societies it claims to protect. Because that is what empires do at the end. They consume their periphery, then they consume their allies, then they consume their own legitimacy. And when legitimacy collapses, the slogans don't save you, the conferences don't save you, the polished statements don't save you, only reality remains. And reality, right now, is moving in one direction toward a settlement written by power, not by virtue. Toward a Europe forced to admit what it is. Toward a Washington that wants tribute without responsibility. Toward a system that is shedding its mask. The mask is slipping. And once people see the face underneath, they never unsee it.